but many believe the race to the Republican nomination for president may already be over after Tuesday. Mitt Romney winning decisively in Florida, garnering 46% of the vote in that key state. One of the main factors, money. He outspent his nearest rival 5-1. In fact, Romney spent more in Florida on campaign commercials, $15 million, than John McCain did through all of the Republican primaries in 2008. So what's in those ads? Well, you might see it, a lot of mud, and it seems to be sticking, at least to his nearest contender, Newt Gingrich. We're going to be looking at where all the money's coming from. In this, the first campaign since the U.S. Supreme Court in 2010 lifted a ban on companies and nonprofits canvassing during a campaign. Now, here in France, we're also in a campaign with much tighter rules as to where all the money comes from. Rules which politicians sometimes get around by shifting big briefcases stuffed with cash. We'll take a look at that, which is, you might say, cruder. We'll have a debate about that if you want. Today in the France 24 debate, politics for sale. And with us, reporter Craig Capitas. Thanks for being with us. From Washington, John Samples, who is the director of the Center for Representative Government at the Cato Institute. Thank you for being with us.
Thank you.
And also with us, Paul Valley, who teaches at Paris's prestigious Sciences Po Political Science Institute. And Benoît Thiolin, director of the web agency. It's called Net Squad, but it's spelled the French.
Net Squad.
It's spelled the French way. So
absolutely.
So that you're French, and you're also an advisor to the web campaign of the socialist candidate here in France, François Hollande. By the way, you can weigh in on the conversation on Facebook and on Twitter, where our handle here is @FrançoisF24. By the way, the guy who finished second in that Florida primary still says he can beat the odds.
And you might say, how are we going to do that? Well, the same way that we came back in June and July, and by December, we're ahead in the Gallup poll nationally by 12 or 13 points with no money. It turned out that if you have ideas and you have solutions and you're positive and you can communicate a better future and you have a history of actually doing something in the past, that the combination begins to reach the American people.
Craig Capitas, your thoughts on what Newt Gingrich just said there?
He's not going anywhere. He doesn't have the money to go anywhere unless another angel falls from the sky from Las Vegas to have him continue through. I just think he's being a poisonous thorn in the side of the presidential process right now. He has every right to do it, but his presence there, to me, is what he's doing with the money that he's doing. It's like presidential elections are far too serious, for the monetized indulgence of these super PACs and attack ads and what he's doing. I just don't think the process that he's on, and even Romney to a great degree, it's let's leave the opposition crippled and humiliated. That's what this seems to be from afar, watching this, and I just don't think that's healthy. I don't think what Gingrich is doing is healthy, but he makes great television theater. There was a report today that I think was very significant. The networks and a lot of our colleagues in the media in the United States, they don't have a lot of money anymore. Money's tight. And I read a story that a lot of the big nets and some of the papers aren't going to be sending their journalists out with Gingrich anymore. He's just not a story, and that's going to hit him. So, he's not this Deus ex machina who's going to come in from nowhere and change everything. And no one's going to, I think, come in and help him. I think that, it's Romney's. Romney's the candidate. End of story.
All right, and folks who back Romney ran some 16,000 TV ads in Florida, 13,000 of which were directed against Gingrich, like this reminder to voters of the day that the then Speaker of the House of Representatives had fallen from grace in Washington back in 1997.
Good evening. Newt Gingrich, who came to power, after all, preaching a higher standard in American politics, a man who brought down another speaker on ethics accusations. Tonight, he has on his own record the judgment of his peers, Democrat and Republican alike, by an overwhelming vote. They found him guilty of ethics violations. They charged him a very large financial penalty, and several of them raised serious questions about his future effectiveness.
I'm Mitt Romney, and I approve this message.
Mitt Romney approved that message. John Samples, do you approve that message?
It's not a question of whether I approve it or not. It's a question of whether they have the right to run it, and they certainly do under the First Amendment. I would ask the viewers to, however, look at the content of that. Many Republican voters in Florida and in other primaries and in primaries to come have said that they're looking for a person of moral character, a person that is consistent on ethics issues. Did that ad speak to that? And of course, you know, Mr. Gingrich had the right to respond to it, that said something has changed or that the charges against him were false, which he in fact did do at various points. I think it's a mistake to think that it's a mistake, first of all, to focus on the money in itself as opposed to what the content of the money is being used for, which is political speech. It's also a mistake to say that it's all mudslinging. You saw right there from the use of that film that went to actual issues that matter to the voters in Florida. Negative criticism of candidates is entirely within the kind of thing you want to hear during a presidential election. In fact, political scientists have found that it increases participation and increases the kind of knowledge that voters have when they go into the booth to vote. So I think demonizing this kind of speech is entirely mistaken, and particularly doing it because by focusing on money rather than what is being said. Money is tied to speech here. That's why in the United States, under the First Amendment, there are protections for spending money on political speech.
Paul Valley?
Well, what John Samples is making the point is of course, significant importance of the Supreme Court ruling of 2010, which basically, of course, ruled that donations to a political campaign are an expression of free speech, and that has lifted a number of previous federal restrictions on caps to individual and collective donations to political campaigns. And what we see in this campaign today is, of course, an illustration of what the new status books allow. And basically, of course, it does transform what is already, of course, when we think about it, a very different American political culture when we try to compare it to European standards or elsewhere in terms of campaign donations, and which explains to us the enormous amount of money that is being spent in what is a primary campaign, when we think that we're not even yet in the bipartisan
in the general
campaign,
election.
The general election campaign, that is of course quite astounding, especially in this time of political crises. Obviously, lack of financial means, states being degraded by ratings agencies, and you consider the amount that is being spent on pre-campaigns, that is, of course, a significant change in our political culture today.
The argument that we heard there from John Samples was that this is free speech.
Well, you know, it's very strange for a French point of view, because all these things are completely forbidden in France. As you said, we have a lot of rules and ads on TV, and all this big financement for the politicians is really very, very different here. So, but I will say that if we look back into the last campaign in France, we had also a lot of violent criticism, but it was not on ads on TV, and it was much more on the internet, and especially on YouTube and video, and a lot of things that were done, and probably moreover because we have a lot of rules on TV. The creativity of the supporters and the internet team is much more on the internet than on the other media.
One has to cut into there because, indeed, the huge price that we're seeing exacted in the U.S. is about television. And that has to be said. I mean, the number of ads in the state of Florida alone since December is really quite astounding.
The velocity of the application of money.
And when we look at the fact that, of course, the 2008 presidential campaign was the costliest campaign in history in the U.S. Yeah. Over $1 billion spent by each candidate. And certainly this might be bypassed this time. When we look at some of the figures that have been filed with the Federal Election Commission this day, it's already quite astounding. Well, of course, we can see obviously the weaknesses of certain candidates who have not managed to raise enough money, but the sheer cost of their campaigning in the primaries is, of course, prohibitive for a lot of them.
But what is interesting, I think, is also to look at the small amounts of money, in fact, because where Obama was really a new way and a new approach of this phenomenon, it was focused on very small amounts of money given by small citizens. And
but his approach has already been bypassed by these new practices.
Yeah,
and
absolutely.
Barack Obama also gets money the old-fashioned way. John Samples?
One side of this.
Not this time.
Yes, if we could. In fact, several things need to be said here. First, while there was an image that Obama ran on mostly small donations, that turned out not to be true. He was about the same as most candidates in the past. Part two, every presidential campaign has cost more than the campaign before it. The reason for that is America has generally enjoyed economic growth. So over a 4-year period, if you spend roughly the same amount of national income on a presidential election, you're going to spend more every election campaign. But again, I would ask you to notice what we're focusing on the money, but the real point is to focus on what the money is used for. The money allows people to engage in political speech, political competition, political debate, and indeed sharp criticism of one another. The fact is that it allows people to bring out both the positive side of it, which is vote for me, but also why you should not vote for the other person. And it's very clear.
But if you don't have the money to get those TV ads out, then then you can't take part in that free speech.
You do have to be able to convince people that you can, in fact, become a candidate that could win. You have to have, as Mr. Gingrich said at the beginning, that's the reason why he thinks he can continue. If you have the ideas, if you have the plausibility that you can make this happen, you can get the candidates. Look at Barack Obama in 2008. He was an outsider. He was poo-pooed as not just another candidate. Yet he was able to stimulate people, a person who came from outside because of his oratorical skills. He was able to raise the money. The people you hear about complaining that they didn't have the money were the people who weren't able to stimulate that kind. And I should mention also, before we get into the idea that it's only rich people who gives to this, these political science studies that have been done of this suggest that a great deal of the money comes from $200 and $300 contributions. If you look at Representative Paul in the Republican primary, who will continue throughout the entire primary season, he's been able, while he does have some larger contributors, he also has a number of enthusiastic and younger people who are supporting him.
All right, but
in fact, I think it is possible.
All right, and just to say though, Mitt Romney is, according to those figures that Paul Valley was mentioning, something like 8% are from small contributions, and most of the money not coming from direct donations, but through what are called political action committees or super PACs. And we can show you just a sample of the folks that gave to Mitt Romney's Restore Our Future super PAC. They include a former partner in his brokerage firm, a billionaire hedge fund manager who bet against the subprime housing mortgage market, John Paulson, and one of the main backers of a negative ad campaign that sank John Kerry's 2004 presidential aspirations, Bob Perry, his ad campaign at the time, Swift Vote Veterans for Truth. And here's what candidate Romney had to say about super PACs. This was back in January.
Let campaigns then take responsibility for their own words and not have this strange situation where we have people out there who support us, who run ads we don't like, we'd like to take off the air, we think are outrageous, and yet they're out there supporting us, and by law, we're not allowed to talk to them.
Craig Kopidis.
The First Amendment is a wonderful, wonderful thing.
The right to free speech.
The right to free speech. And these candidates have every right to do what they're doing. And it's kind of like you have to support pornography, because if they shut down the pornographers, well, the next people they might shut down is the Wall Street Journal. That's how it works in the United States. There's a certain absolutism, and I can't emphasize that enough. But let's look at the other side of this for one moment. These super PACs, for many, many people, are involved in what's clearly abusive behavior. It doesn't look good, it doesn't smell good, and it certainly doesn't taste good. You even just heard Mitt Romney, the presumptive Republican candidate for President of the United States, saying essentially the same thing. But of course, he has a right to utilize this, as do all the candidates. I think what you're seeing here, these super PACs, are a symptom of how the American political system has spun out of control. It's become mean and it's become venal. And yes, historically it always has been. The Lincoln-Douglas debates, for instance, they used to yell at Lincoln and Douglas. They'd throw things at him. Go back to the old cartoons, as you know, Professor, which I'm sure you've studied. American politics have always been dirty. But the moment you put it on television and you broadcast this out to millions and millions of people, it does and has created a psychological numbing effect that, despite the gentleman from the Cato's Institute studies, which I'm sure are absolutely accurate, I think in the long term, they turn more voters off than they turn voters on. And I think you will see that come this fall when you see how many people actually go out and vote. And you look, I don't remember the statistics off the top of my head, but even from the primary we were covering there last night at François Picard in Florida, the number of people who actually went out to vote was down from the last primary down there by a significant number. I don't recall the actual percentage. So I think this type of behavior denigrates the political system and turns people off.
If I can add on to that, of course, we owe to the viewers pointing out what is referred to as a super PAC is a super political action committee, right. And that is basically, of course, a front for the candidate that collects
It's
money.
a loophole.
And, it is a loophole that existed before...
It's the First Amendment. It's the First Amendment in action. I wouldn't call it a loophole. I think you have to call it the First Amendment in action.
The phenomenon existed before the Supreme Court ruling of 2010, but of course the Supreme Court actually lifted a number of restrictions on which donations and whose donations can be brought into the super PACs. And all of the candidates, President Obama has a super PAC, Mr. Romney has a super PAC, Mr. Gingrich has a super PAC. All of them have these PACs that obviously exist, especially to fund television ads.
All right, and
the big cost.
When we come back, we'll look at what's in those ads. Stay with us. You're watching the France 24 debate.
Get into the rhythm of African soccer. Africa Cup Fever until February 12th on France 24.